Hello and welcome to the Business of Law, brought to you by Bloomberg Law and the ABA Journal. I'm Sarah Kopit, sitting in today for Lee Packia. The key metric for Big Law is average profits per equity partner. But our guest today says that isn't the number to look at if you want to judge the health of a law firm and what most partners actually earn. He's Stephen J. Harper, an adjunct professor at Northwestern University, former partner at Kirkland and Ellis, and author of the new book, The Lawyer Bubble. Stephen joins us today from Bloomberg Chicago Bureau. Stephen, welcome back to the program. You recently wrote that Big Law is increasing its profits per partner, not so much by growing revenues, but by slowing the growth of the equity partner ranks. Tell us more about this.
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon. If you have a situation where it's hard because of the growth or lack of growth in the economy and in the law sector in particular, to increase profits that way, that is by growing the pie. The question is then how do you allocate what's coming in so that average partner profits can continue to grow in the face of a relatively stagnant legal market? And the answer is you can pull up the ladder. That is, if you're an equity partner, you can make the trek to equity partnership longer and more difficult, make fewer equity partners, and as a result of that, you increase the size of the pieces of the pie that are available for distribution to a smaller group.
You've also written that observers ought to be focused on the gap between the highest and lowest paid equity partners, and that gap's been growing. Why is that the key metric?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. You know, statisticians will tell you that averages are only meaningful if what you're looking at or trying to understand is what they call a normal distribution. That is what we would refer to as a bell-shaped curve. The average is typically the top of that curve. The problem is that what has happened in the past 10 years in particular is that is not at all what the distribution of equity partner profits looks like within a law firm. So rather than, for example, a big group in the middle representing a high average or the average of the partnership, you've had spreads between the very top partners, that is those who earn the most money, and the very bottom equity partners, those who earn the least, that's grown dramatically. So that 10 years ago, the average spread, 15 years ago, the average spread within an equity partnership, top to bottom, was perhaps 3-to-1 or maybe 4-to-1. In some firms, it may have been as high as 5-to-1. Now that spread has grown to in excess of 10-to-1. At Dewey and LaBeouf, for example, the firm that failed last year, the reported spread between the top of the equity partnership and the bottom of the equity partnership in terms of income was 20-to-1. There were senior partners at Dewey who referred to that as the barbell approach to compensation. You have a handful of Rainmakers at one end, and then you have the so-called service partners on the other end of the barbell, a much larger number of people. But that gap means, the existence of that gap means that if you average those two numbers, you may wind up with a number that's somewhere in the middle, but it isn't going to really reflect the situation with respect to the so-called average partner in that big law firm.
Right. But if firms can't pay their lateral partners for bringing in big books of business, how can firms attract talent to grow those revenues?
Well, that's an interesting question that's caught up in much broader trends in the profession that have, I think, destabilized the profession. You're referring in particular to what I regard now really as a lateral hiring frenzy. And one of the things that's happened in the stagnant market, that is the no-growth demand market, law firms in particular, have decided that the way they're going to grow top-line revenues is by hiring books of business. The problem is that you wind up in a number of things happen. One is that you can wind up in a bidding war where you're overpaying for lateral talent, but it typically takes many years in order to determine that. And second, even managing partners today who admit that they're adhering to that kind of aggressive strategy of recruiting lateral partners have acknowledged in recent surveys that only about half of those lateral hires are anything better than a break-even proposition for them. And that's before you even get to the non-economic costs that are imposed on the partnership in terms of the culture of the partnership and what it means when all of a sudden you're bringing in these people from a lot of different places. You go to a partners meeting and you don't recognize a third or a half of the people in the room.
So do you think that we need to go back to a partner compensation structure where it's essentially lockstep? The more senior the partner, the more he or she earns?
Well, I think there are a lot of advantages to lockstep over other systems in terms of the incentives that it creates for the people inside the partnership. If you know, and I had mentors at my firm for many years who told me that because of the way that firm at the time was structured, the only way they could make more money, that is the top people in the firm could make more money, was by growing the firm, by growing the pie. That creates a lot of positive incentives in terms of transitioning younger people to significant client responsibilities, not being fearful of losing client connections if you're a senior partner for fear that your compensation will be cut if you do. I call that the phenomenon of partners who build client silos so that if they need to, they can find themselves a spot on the lateral market or test those waters. So I think there are a lot of things that go to the underlying stability of these institutions that gives lockstep systems a lot to commend themselves in terms of the incentive structures that it creates. And when you think about, for most of these big firms, the enormous amounts of money that are being earned by equity partners take the Am Law 100, for example. 25 years ago, the average equity partner in an Am Law 50 firm, which was the first year that it came out in 1987, earned $300,000 a year. That was the average. Last year, it was that same group of the Am Law 50 was $1.7 million. And even adjusting for inflation, you'd only get to about $600,000. So there's a tremendous amount of money floating around in these places, and they can really adopt whatever structure they want to adopt in terms of how they choose to compensate their people. But they're all fearful, and the fear is this: well, what if I lose somebody with a big book of business to somebody else? And frankly, my answer to that is if you're going to lose somebody, for relatively inconsequential dollars, maybe that's somebody whose motives are such that he's not a particularly great addition to your law firm anyway in terms of the overall culture and stability of the institution.
But you don't think that lockstep is actually going to make a comeback, do you?
I don't know if it will or not. I mean, there are some tremendously successful, profitable, stable, some of the most prestigious firms in the country have retained their lockstep systems, and they're doing pretty well. Cravath, Debevoise, a number of big firms that are among the very best in the profession, who have the very best lawyers, among the very best lawyers in the profession. So I don't know if it'll make a comeback or not, but I think that when you have these situations where, by virtue of, for example, lateral hiring or the resulting instability that you get when a law firm loses its identity, there are going to be opportunities, I think, for what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction, and I think there's going to be a fair amount of change and transition to something else. And I would not exclude lockstep as something that looks pretty appealing to, say, the next generation. Maybe not my generation, but go ahead 10 or 15 or 20 years, and I think the whole thing could look a lot different from the way it does now. Of course, I could be wrong too, and we could go the profession could go away the way of the investment banks, and you could have even more pronounced gaps and inequalities.
Yeah. So what we're really talking about is income inequality, and that's been growing across the board in the United States. So are you really surprised that it's also happening at the nation's biggest law firms?
No, I'm not surprised at all. And the question is, at some point, most people who are my age, for example, baby boomers, for example, if you ask them why did they go to law school, very few of them would say that they did it because they thought they were going to get rich. The legal profession is supposed to be something special, something different. So I don't think it's an excuse to say, well, we're just becoming more like everybody else. We're following the trends of business and big corporations and big banks, a lot of which haven't really comported themselves all that well in terms of what they've done for the rest of the economy and the society in recent years. So I don't really take much comfort in the knowledge that we're just part of a much larger group that's sort of also developed this myopic mindset towards short-termism.
So, Stephen, give me the magic number. At Big Law today, what's the ideal spread between the highest and lowest paid equity partners? Great question.
And I guess I would take as an example, the model that was working 15 or 20 years ago at most firms throughout the country. And I think, although I don't have hard information on this, although I'm told that the American Lawyer is going to be publishing more information about internal spreads over the next in its next issue. But 3 to 1 to 4 to 1 is that's a healthy top to bottom when you have the kinds of multi-million-dollar. Even the person who's at the bottom is going to be well into seven figures in the AmLaw 50 or the AmLaw 100 on a 3 to 1 or 4 to 1 range. And at some point, I think it's worth the people who are who I would put at the 3 to 1, that is the top, who are now maybe at the 10 to 1, 10 times their fellow junior partners. How much is enough? And if the answer is more, maybe it's worth rethinking it.
All right, Stephen Harper, very interesting information. Thank you very much for joining us today. That's Stephen Harper, author of the new book, The Lawyer Bubble. To learn more about the issues we just discussed, please be sure to check out our offerings on BloombergLaw.com and the Bloomberg Terminal. I'm Sarah Kopit. Thanks for watching.